Sasha Brooks stepped onto the Sky-High Airlines plane with that damn confident aura that made everyone turn their heads. She wasn't the flashy type, but the way she moved, head held high, shoulders straight, each step solid like she was strutting down a runway, made it impossible not to notice her. That day she wore a fitted black blazer, underneath a sharply tailored dress that accentuated her curves effortlessly. Her natural curls cascaded around her face, each strand declaring, "I'm here and I don't need to prove a damn thing to you." In one hand she held a sleek leather briefcase, the kind that made people immediately assume there was an empire inside. In the other, a tightly gripped plane ticket, first class, damn it, not some cheap knockoff. Headphone, welcome to Soul Deep Stories. Glowing star, if you're lost in this story, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another tale that touches the heart. Sparkling heart. Pushpin, I've got a little challenge for you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. For example, I'm in New York, USA, soaking in this story at 9 p.m. Crescent moon, what about you? Let's connect from all over the world. Globe showing Europe, Africa sparkles. Speech balloon, don't forget to like and share to spread these meaningful stories to more people. Thank you for being part of Soul Deep Stories. Red heart. Now let's dive back into the story. Sasha walked down the narrow aisle between the rows of seats, her sharp gaze scanning the seat numbers like a hawk hunting its prey. Not with the nervousness of a first-time flyer, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Passengers around her started sneaking glances, a few whispering to each other, "Who the hell is she? Damn, she looks good." But Sasha didn't bother acknowledging them. She was used to the stares, the silent judgments that screamed, "You don't look like the usual first-class passenger." To her, they were just background noise, not worth a second of her time. Reaching her first-class seat, 2A by the window, she gave a subtle smile to the middle-aged man in 2B. Gray suit, gold-rimmed glasses, the type who thought he was more important than he actually was. He nodded back, though his gaze lingered on her a little too long, as if trying to assess whether she deserved to be there. Sasha didn't care. She opened the overhead compartment and slid her briefcase in with a motion so smooth it was almost an art form. Then she took her seat, pulled out a small notebook and an expensive fountain pen, and started scribbling, quick, determined strokes, like she was plotting world domination right there on this damn flight. She sank into her own world, pen gliding across the page, head slightly tilted, brows furrowed in deep concentration. The people around her ceased to exist, at least for Sasha. But then, from somewhere in the cabin, a figure stormed in like a whirlwind. Tiffany Hayes. The flight attendant in a form-fitting blue uniform that clung to her frame, appearing like she meant business. Tiffany wasn't the sweet, welcome aboard, dear passenger type from airline commercials. No, she was the kind with eyes sharp as razor blades, lips pressed tight, and a permanent expression that suggested the world owed her an apology. Her hair was pulled into a high ponytail, every strand locked in place with enough hairspray to withstand turbulence. But her face was flushed red with something, frustration, exhaustion, or maybe just the sheer agony of working on this damn plane all day. Tiffany strode through first class, one hand on her hip, eyes sweeping over the passengers like a cop patrolling a rough neighborhood. She stopped when she saw Sasha. Not a casual stop, but a full-on freeze, head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing, like she had just spotted a cockroach in her food. Something about Sasha rubbed Tiffany the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she sat there so effortlessly, too at ease in that expensive leather seat. Or maybe it was the fact that Sasha didn't look like the typical first-class passenger Tiffany was used to, rich, entitled old white men with beer guts and an inflated sense of self-importance. No, Sasha was different. She was young, black, and carried herself like she could buy this whole damn plane if she felt like it. Tiffany took a deep breath, stepping closer, heels clicking sharply against the airplane floor. "Excuse me, miss," she said, voice laced with that fake politeness Americans use when they're trying to humiliate someone. "Let me see your ticket." Sasha looked up, slightly surprised but unfazed. Her eyes locked onto Tiffany's, unblinking as if silently asking, "Did you really just say that to me?" But she remained composed, lips curling into a faint smile. "Of course," she said smoothly, handing over the ticket without hesitation. Tiffany snatched it from her like it was a piece of trash, flipping it back and forth, scanning every word like she was searching for a mistake. Some excuse to throw Sasha out of first class. "First class, huh?" Tiffany sneered, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You sure about that?" Sasha tilted her head slightly, eyes sharp as glass. "Yeah, I'm sure. Is there a problem?" Tiffany's lips curled into a smirk, the kind that made it clear she meant no good. She shoved the ticket back at Sasha, but the way she dropped it into her hand felt more like tossing away a crumpled receipt than returning a legitimate boarding pass. "No, no problem at all," she said, her voice sickly sweet. "Just checking." But her eyes told a different story. They burned with a silent question. "Who the hell does this girl think she is, sitting here?" Sasha shrugged, dismissing her without another word. She turned back to her notebook, pen gliding across the paper as if the exchange had never happened. But Tiffany wasn't done. She spun on her heel and stalked toward the galley, posture stiff, hands clenched at her sides like she was holding back the urge to slam something. When she reached the small crew area, she leaned in close to Jake Russo, another flight attendant, voice low but thick with irritation. "You see that black chick in 2A?" she muttered. "The way she's sitting there like she owns the damn plane? I'd bet 10 to 1 she's in the wrong seat." Jake, a grizzled middle-aged guy with salt and pepper hair and the weary look of someone who had seen too much, glanced over his shoulder at Sasha before turning back to Tiffany. "You check her ticket?" he asked, his voice calm but skeptical. "I did. First class is legit," Tiffany spat, arms crossing tightly. "But I don't buy it. She doesn't look like she belongs here." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't look like she belongs? What exactly do you mean by that?" Tiffany shrugged, lips pressed into a tight line. "I mean, she doesn't look like the rich old guys or stuck-up rich ladies that usually sit here. I just have a feeling, okay? Don't lecture me." Jake shook his head but didn't argue. He knew that once Tiffany got worked up, reasoning with her was useless. Meanwhile, Sasha remained in seat 2A, her pen gliding across the page, completely unaware of the vile conversation happening behind her back. But the atmosphere in first class started to shift, growing heavier, like everyone could sense the tension Tiffany had just injected into the space. A few minutes later, Tiffany returned, this time with an even worse attitude. She stood beside Sasha's seat, one hand on her hip, looking down at her like she was some kind of trash that needed to be removed. "Excuse me, miss," Tiffany said, her voice sharp and commanding. "I need you to stand up for a moment. I have to check something with your seat." Sasha paused mid-sentence, looking up again. This time, her eyes held something different, not fear but the unmistakable expression of "Are you really trying me right now?" Still she remained calm. Setting her pen down, she stood slowly, picking up her sleek leather bag. "Check what exactly?" she asked, her voice smooth but razor-sharp. Tiffany crossed her arms, smirking. "There might be a mistake with your ticket. I need you to step into the galley with me for a moment, okay? Don't make this difficult. I don't have time for arguments." Passengers nearby started turning their heads, some whispering, others pretending not to notice but clearly eavesdropping. Sasha frowned slightly but didn't resist. She gave a single, measured nod before following Tiffany toward the galley. Her head stayed high, her stride unshaken, as if this pathetic display of power had no effect on her. Once they reached the galley, Tiffany pulled the curtain closed, creating a private space between them. She turned back to Sasha, eyes blazing. "Listen up, sweetheart," Tiffany hissed, dropping all pretense of politeness. "I don't know who the hell you are, but I don't believe that seat belongs to you. Maybe you have a real ticket, but you don't belong in first class. Got it? I need you to take your ass back to economy right now before I call security to drag you out. Don't test me, little girl." Sasha didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her stare ice-cold. "I have a valid ticket," she said, voice steady with an almost dangerous calm. "I booked that seat a month ago and it was confirmed. If you need to verify it again, go ahead. But I'm not going anywhere." Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her voice grating against the enclosed space. "Valid?" she sneered. "You think I care? I said you don't belong here and that's the end of it. Now get your ass to economy before I make you." This time, Sasha didn't answer right away. She took a slow breath, her eyes narrowing slightly. But that eerie calm never wavered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her fingers gliding across the screen as if preparing something. Tiffany saw it but didn't care, she was too wrapped up in her own anger. "What the hell are you doing? Calling a lawyer? Go ahead. I don't give a damn." Tiffany snapped, her voice rising. Sasha didn't respond. She simply held Tiffany's gaze for another second, then turned and walked toward the economy cabin without a word. But the way she walked, shoulders straight, head high, completely unfazed, sent a sudden chill down Tiffany's spine. Sasha settled into her new seat in 17D, right in the middle of economy, where the air was thick with a mix of sweat, cheap perfume, and the stale scent of overused fabric. To her left, a heavy-set middle-aged woman chewed gum loudly, smacking it like a cow chewing cud. To her right, a lanky teenage boy bobbed his head to blaring rap music, his oversized headphones leaking bass-heavy beats into the cramped space. The seat was stiff, the cushion almost non-existent, a far cry from the plush leather of first class. But Sasha showed no sign of discomfort. Her head remained high, her posture unshaken, her sharp eyes fixed ahead, as if this inconvenient detour was nothing more than a minor pause in a much bigger plan. She placed her sleek leather briefcase beneath the seat in front of her, fingers grazing its smooth surface, a quiet reminder that this downgrade didn't define her. Tiffany Hayes, the miserable flight attendant who had just humiliated her in front of an entire first-class cabin, might think she had crushed Sasha under her heel, but she was wrong. Sasha wasn't the type to scream or sob when someone tried to step on her. No, she was the kind who stayed silent, letting her anger smolder, fueling it until it burned down the world of whoever had dared to cross her. She pulled out her phone, her long fingers gliding over the screen as she opened her messaging app. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger but in that lethal focus that anyone who had ever worked with Sasha knew all too well. She typed quickly. Just got kicked down to economy by some idiot flight attendant. Handle this. No. Don't let it slide. She hit send. The message shot straight to Jamal, an old college friend who now sat in the executive office of Sky High Airlines. Jamal wasn't the kind of man who ignored problems, and Sasha knew that with one call from her, the entire airline would feel the aftershocks. She locked her phone, tucked it back into her pocket and leaned back into her seat, arms crossed. Outside the scratched-up window, white clouds drifted lazily past, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her mind. Sasha didn't believe in petty revenge. No, what she wanted was justice. A lesson that people like Tiffany wouldn't forget. She pictured the moment Tiffany would realize what she had done, that sinking horror as the weight of her mistake crushed down on her. The thought made the corners of Sasha's lips twitch slightly, but she quickly suppressed it, keeping that same icy composure she had perfected over the years. Meanwhile, in first class, Tiffany paced the aisle, holding a tray of orange juice like she was the queen of this godforsaken airplane. A fake smile was plastered across her face as she served sweaty businessmen in too tight suits, but her eyes flicked back toward the economy cabin more times than she'd admit. She felt a smug satisfaction. She had put that black girl in her place, and she thought she had asserted her authority. And yet, deep in her gut, something twisted. An unease she couldn't quite shake. It's over, she told herself. But as she recalled the way Sasha had looked at her, not fearful, not hesitant, just that cold, cutting stare that sliced right through her, Tiffany couldn't help but wonder. Was it? Tiffany stepped back into the galley where Jake Russo leaned against the wall, holding a cup of cold coffee. Did you see how I handled that girl? She boasted, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. Nobody sits in first class without me catching them. Jake took a slow sip, watching her over the rim of his cup. You sure about that? Her ticket was valid. Tiffany shrugged, placing a hand on her hip. So what? I don't care. One look at her and I knew she didn't belong. You think I'm letting someone like that sit with the big shots? Give me a break. Jake set his cup down, his tone dropping to a quiet warning. Tiff, you're playing with fire. First class isn't your personal playground. If she files a complaint, you're screwed. Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls of the galley. Complain? About me? That girl wishes. I've been doing this for 10 years, I know exactly how to handle people like her. Jake just shook his head, saying nothing more. He had seen Tiffany pull stunts like this before and they always ended in trouble, but this time he had a bad feeling it would be much worse. Back in economy, Sasha remained still, but her mind was anything but. She pulled out her phone, checking for Jamal's response. The screen lit up with a short message. Handling it. Sit tight. I'll call you when it's done. Sasha nodded slightly, tucking her phone away before glancing at the woman next to her, still chewing her gum obnoxiously. You always chew that loud? Sasha asked, her tone light but teasing as if just to pass the time. The woman grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. Good gum. You want one? She held out a crumpled piece of candy. Sasha smiled politely and shook her head. I'm good, thanks. She turned back toward the window, but inside she was mapping out her next move. She wasn't the type to sit back and wait, but this time she knew patience was necessary. Jamal wasn't an amateur, and she had no doubt he'd make Tiffany regret ever looking at her the wrong way. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the economy cabin wash over her. The baby crying a few rows ahead, the hacking cough of an elderly man, the loud laughter of a group of rowdy passengers in the back. It was chaos, but to Sasha it was familiar. She had grown up in Harlem, where disorder was a way of life. She had spent years crammed onto packed buses, had endured the way security guards in department stores watched her like she was a thief, all because of the color of her skin. But she never let it break her. Every insult, every humiliation, she had turned them into fuel, using them to climb higher. And this time would be no different. She opened her eyes when she felt someone watching her. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, sat across the aisle, sneaking glances at her through the gap between the seats. She had dyed blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the kind of girl who looked like she had just stepped out of some small town in the Midwest. "You okay?" the girl asked softly, curiosity laced in her voice. "I saw what that flight attendant did to you. She's a real bitch." Sasha turned her head, her sharp expression softening just a little. "I'm fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Thanks for asking. As for her, let her dig her own grave." The girl let out a quiet giggle, nodding. "You're cool. If I were you, I'd have screamed my lungs out so the whole plane could hear." Sasha smirked. "And what would that accomplish? I prefer to let my actions do the talking." She didn't say anything more, but the look in her eyes silenced the girl. An unspoken message that Sasha Brooks was not someone to be messed with. A few minutes later, Emily Parker, another flight attendant, entered the economy cabin. Emily was nothing like Tiffany. She was younger, with simple brown hair tied in a ponytail, and the way she smiled at passengers was genuinely warm, not the fake politeness of someone who had done this job for too long. She carried a cup of water and walked over to Sasha. "Hello," Emily said gently. "Do you need anything? I saw that you were moved down here." "I'm sorry about that." Sasha looked up, her gaze softening slightly at the kindness in Emily's eyes. "Thank you," she said, accepting the water. "I'm fine, just a little trouble." Emily nodded but didn't leave right away. "If you need anything, just call me. I'm Emily." She smiled before returning to her duties, leaving Sasha with the cold cup in her hands. Sasha took a sip, the cool liquid sliding down her throat, waking her up. She placed the cup on the tray, her right hand unconsciously tapping against the armrest, a habit she'd had since childhood whenever she was deep in thought. Tiffany might think she had one, but Sasha knew better. This was just the opening act. She wasn't the type to make a scene right away. She preferred to wait, to let her enemies walk into the trap before she pulled the strings tight. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Sasha pulled it out and unlocked the screen. A message from Jamal: "Talk to management. They're reviewing the plane's security footage. Just relax, I'll make sure that bitch regrets opening her mouth." Sasha read it, a small, knowing smirk forming at the corner of her lips. She typed back, "Good. Don't let her get away with it. I want results." She locked her screen, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and leaned her head against the seat, closing her eyes. The noise in the economy cabin was still loud, an infant wailing a few rows up, an old man coughing hoarsely, a group of guys at the back laughing obnoxiously, but it no longer bothered her. Instead, she focused on the image forming in her mind. Tiffany, standing frozen, her face drained of color as she realized who she had just messed with. Sasha didn't need to yell or curse like Tiffany had. She just had to sit back, wait, and let people like Jamal take care of the rest. But deep inside her, a fire still burned, and she knew without a doubt. Tiffany Hayes was about to find out that she had just kicked a hornet's nest bigger than her worst nightmare. Sasha Brooks remained in her miserable 17D seat in economy, her sharp eyes staring out the window as the slow-moving white clouds drifted by, almost mocking the humiliation she had just endured. The cup of water Emily Parker had given her sat untouched on the tray, condensation dripping down the sides like sweat on the forehead of someone who knew their time was up. Inside her head, everything was turning, not out of fear, but because of the cold, calculated plan she had set into motion the moment she texted Jamal. Sasha wasn't the kind of person to sit back and let others walk all over her with a smirk. No, she was the kind of person who made sure her enemies knelt before her and begged for forgiveness, even if it meant setting fire to the whole damn plane to make it happen. Up front, in first class, Tiffany Hayes moved between the seats with an air of victory, as if she had just won a gold medal in kicking people down. Her grin stretched wide as she served orange juice to a few wealthy businessmen, playing the role of a perfect flight attendant, but her eyes kept darting toward the economy cabin. She thought she had won, had successfully booted Sasha out of that plush first-class seat and locked her away in the miserable back rows. But that triumphant feeling was starting to fade, replaced by a creeping chill every time she remembered the look in Sasha's eyes as she was forced to leave. No fear, no trembling, just a gaze sharp as a blade, cutting through Tiffany like it was whispering, "You'll regret this." Tiffany stormed back to the galley, slamming the tray of orange juice down with a loud clack, then planted her hands on her hips, exhaling sharply. Jake Russo, leaning against the wall with a cup of cold coffee in his hand, raised an eyebrow as he sipped from the rim. "You good, Tiff?" he asked, his tone low but laced with amusement. "You look like you just kicked a hornet's nest." Tiffany scoffed, spinning around to glare at him. "I'm fine, okay? That girl is in the back where she belongs. It's over. Don't make a big deal out of it." Jake raised an eyebrow, took a sip of his coffee, then smirked. "Over? You sure about that? The way she looked at you didn't exactly scream defeat. You should be careful, Tiff. First class isn't the place to play discrimination games." Tiffany let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the cramped galley. "Discrimination? Don't be ridiculous, Jake. I was just doing my job, keeping this cabin for the right people. That girl looked like she just crawled out of a slum. You really think she belongs here?" Jake shook his head, setting his cup down. "Her ticket was legit. You had no right to kick her out just because she didn't look the part. If she's someone important, you're screwed." Tiffany crossed her arms, sneering. "Important? To me? I don't give a damn. If she even thinks about complaining, I'll make sure she swallows every word." But despite her bravado, a knot was forming in her stomach. Something felt off, the way Sasha had stayed so calm, the way she had typed something on her phone before leaving the galley. It made Tiffany uneasy and she hated that feeling. Back in the economy cabin, Sasha remained seated, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest, her gaze thoughtful. She no longer paid attention to the woman chewing gum beside her or the guy blasting music through his headphones, all just background noise to the calculations running through her head. Her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out and unlocked the screen. A message from Jamal. "The cameras caught everything. Management is holding an emergency meeting. Just sit tight, I'll have that bitch crying in 10 minutes. Sasha read it, a cold smile curling her lips. She typed back, "Good. Don't let her off easy. I want her on her knees." Slipping her phone back into her pocket, she stood up, reaching for her leather bag in the overhead compartment to retrieve a small bottle of water. Her movements were calm yet commanding, as if silently declaring, "I am still me no matter where you try to put me." But just then Tiffany appeared in the aisle, holding a tray of orange juice, her eyes blazing the moment she saw Sasha standing in the middle of economy like she still owned the place. "Hey you!" Tiffany screeched, her shrill voice cutting through the cabin, making several passengers turn their heads. "Sit your ass down and stop causing a scene, you stupid little bitch." Sasha turned, her icy gaze locking onto Tiffany. "I was just getting some water," she said evenly, her voice calm but carrying a deadly undertone. "Is that a problem?" Tiffany stormed forward, the tray in her hands shaking with rage. "A problem? You're the problem, you piece of trash. I told you to get the hell out of first class, and now you think you can stand up and act like you still matter? Sit the fuck down before I knock you down myself." Sasha didn't move. She simply stood there, holding her bottle, looking at Tiffany as one would watch a rabid dog barking. But Tiffany couldn't stand that quiet defiance. She stepped closer, intentionally sticking her foot out to block Sasha's path, then shoved her hard in the shoulder. Sasha lost her balance, crashing onto the floor of the aisle. The bottle slipped from her hand, rolling toward a stunned passenger's feet. A loud, dull thud echoed through the cabin. And then silence. Every passenger in the vicinity had gone quiet, eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. The only sound left was Tiffany's own heavy breathing, her chest rising and falling with adrenaline. "There. Serves you right," Tiffany spat, standing over Sasha with her arms crossed. "Don't even think about getting back up, you filthy bitch. I told you, you don't belong here." Sasha lay still for a second, hands braced against the floor, head slightly lowered. Then, slowly she lifted her head. Her eyes were no longer ice, they were fire. A wildfire, blazing with a fury so intense it could burn Tiffany to ash. She rose to her feet, brushing off her hands, then took a single step toward Tiffany, her voice low but razor-sharp. "What the fuck did you just do?" Tiffany sneered, refusing to back down. "I just taught you a lesson, girl. What else do you want?" She raised the tray of orange juice and deliberately flung it straight at Sasha. The golden liquid splattered all over Sasha's black blazer, streaming down her dress and soaking into her hands. The sickly sweet scent of oranges mixed with the stale airplane air, and the passengers erupted into murmurs, some even yelling, "What the fuck?" in pure American fashion. Sasha remained still, orange juice dripping from her fingers onto the floor, but her expression didn't change, that same deadly calm. She wiped a drop from her cheek, then fixed her razor-sharp gaze on Tiffany, making the flight attendant shudder for a split second. "Are you done?" Sasha asked, her voice soft but as cold as a winter wind. Tiffany opened her mouth, ready to hurl another insult, but before she could, Emily Parker came rushing from the back of the cabin, her face pale as a sheet. "Tiffany, what the hell are you doing?" Emily shrieked, her voice trembling with shock. "Are you insane?" Tiffany spun around, growling at Emily. "Shut up, kid. I'm teaching this little bitch her place." Emily stepped forward, trying to pull Tiffany back, but she yanked her arm away, turning back to Sasha with fire in her eyes. "What now, huh? You want to hit me? Go ahead and try. I'll make sure you don't get off this plane in one piece." Sasha didn't respond. She just stood there, orange juice still dripping from her sleeve, her eyes locked onto Tiffany's face as if memorizing every single detail. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back to her seat, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that radiated authority. She pulled out her phone, fingers gliding across the screen, and sent another message to Jamal. "She tripped me and threw juice at me. Handle it now. I want her crying before this plane lands." She hit send, locked her screen and leaned back in her seat. The cabin was still buzzing with whispers. Some passengers discreetly recorded the incident on their phones, while others shouted, "Call the captain." Tiffany stood frozen, panting, the empty tray in her trembling hands. But deep in her gut, an unsettling dread crawled up her spine. She stole one last glance at Sasha before turning and marching back to the galley, but this time her stride lacked its usual confidence. It was shaky, as if she knew she had crossed a line she could never return from. Inside the galley, Jake watched as Tiffany stormed in, her face pale. "What the hell did you just do out there?" he asked, his voice low but tense. Tiffany slammed the tray onto the counter, her hands shaking. I taught that bitch a lesson. She had the nerve to act all high and mighty with me." Jake straightened, his expression darkening. "You tripped her? Threw juice at her? In front of a whole cabin full of passengers?" His voice dropped even lower. "Tiff, you've lost your damn mind. If she's someone important, you're not just losing your job, you're getting sued into oblivion." Tiffany growled, but her voice wavered. "Important? No fucking way. She's just some." Before she could finish, the phone in the galley rang, a sharp, icy chime that sliced through her words. Jake glanced at Tiffany, then picked up the receiver. He listened for a moment, his face gradually draining of color. Then he turned to her. "It's from corporate," he said grimly. "They want to speak with you. Right now." Tiffany blinked, her hands trembling as she picked up the receiver. "Hello? This is Tiffany Hayes." Her voice trailed off as a deep, icy voice from the other end spoke. "Ms. Hayes, we have just received reports about your behavior on this flight. Brace yourself because this is only the beginning." Tiffany let go of the receiver, her hands shaking as if she were about to drop it. She turned back to Jake, eyes wide with panic. What do you think?" she stammered. Jake shook his head, his voice devoid of emotion. "I think you just dug your own grave. And that girl? She's not someone you should have messed with." Meanwhile, Sasha sat in seat 17D, her blazer still damp with orange juice, but her expression remained unchanged. She knew Tiffany was spiraling into panic, and she knew Jamal was handling the situation. There was no need for her to yell or fight back. She just had to sit there, wait, and let the storm she had unleashed wipe everything away. But deep in her chest, the fire still burned, and she swore that Tiffany Hayes would pay, not just in tears but with her entire miserable career. The economy cabin of the Sky High Airlines flight was still buzzing with the remnants of chaos from the altercation between Sasha Brooks and Tiffany Hayes. Orange juice stained Sasha's black blazer, dripping onto the floor and leaving pale yellow streaks on the narrow aisle. The surrounding passengers whispered among themselves, some discreetly recording videos on their phones, while others shook their heads as if to say, "What the hell just happened?" Sasha remained still in seat 17D, calmly wiping a stray drop of juice from her wrist, her piercing gaze fixed straight ahead as if the entire mess wasn't even worth her attention. But inside her, the fire burned, not the kind that exploded instantly, but the slow, relentless kind, ready to consume anyone who stood in her way. In the galley, Tiffany leaned against the wall, her hands still trembling after the call from corporate. The phone had been placed back on its hook, but the cold, menacing voice from the other end still echoed in her mind. "Brace yourself because this is only the beginning." Her face was pale, sweat rolling down her forehead despite the airplane's air conditioning blasting at full power. Jake Russo stood across from her, arms crossed, looking at her like she was a trapped animal with no escape. "You heard what they said, right?" Jake asked, his voice low but tense. "I told you not to mess with that girl. And now what, Tiff? How are you feeling now?" Tiffany growled, turning to glare at him with fiery eyes. "I don't fucking know. Okay. They just told me to brace myself, but I didn't even do anything wrong. That bitch is the problem, not me," she yelled, her voice cracking with panic. But the way her hands clenched into fists, the way her lips quivered, it was clear she knew everything was falling apart. She just didn't want to admit it. Jake smirked, shaking his head. "You tripped her, threw juice on her, in front of the entire damn cabin. And you think that's not doing anything wrong?" He scoffed. "Tiff, you're not just stupid, you're blind. If that girl has even an ounce of power, you're done for." Tiffany opened her mouth to argue, but just then the phone in the galley rang again, its sharp chime cutting through the air like a knife. She blinked, her hands trembling as she reached for the receiver once more. "Hello?" Tiffany Hayes speaking. Her voice faded, and then her face drained of all color. On the other end, a man's voice spoke, not loud, but with a quiet authority that sent Tiffany's entire world into a downward spiral. "Miss Hayes, this is Captain Tom Sullivan. I just received a report from management. Do you have any idea who you just messed with?" Tiffany swallowed hard, gripping the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. I don't understand, Captain," she stammered. "I was just doing my job." "Be quiet," Captain Sullivan cut her off, his voice as cold as ice. "The person you tripped and threw juice on is Sasha Brooks. Do you have any idea who Sasha Brooks is?" Tiffany blinked, her mind going blank. "Sasha Brooks? I don't know. She's just a passenger." "Sasha Brooks," Sullivan interrupted again, enunciating every word, "is the third largest shareholder of Sky High Airlines and sits on the board of directors. She is not just a passenger, she is someone who could bring this entire company to its knees if she wanted to. And you, Tiffany Hayes, have just made yourself her personal enemy." The receiver slipped from Tiffany's grip, hitting the counter with a dry clack. She stood frozen, eyes wide, mouth hanging open as if someone had just punched her in the face. Jake stepped forward, picking up the receiver, but his gaze never left Tiffany. "You heard that, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low, laced with mocking amusement. "You just went head-to-head with a goddamn shark, Tiff. Congratulations." Tiffany didn't respond. She staggered backward against the wall, clutching her head, her breathing shallow as if she were about to pass out. "Shareholder? Board of directors?" she mumbled, her voice shaking. "No way. That bitch. Why didn't I know? Why didn't anyone tell me?" She turned to Jake, eyes wild with desperation. "Jake, you have to help me. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Jake crossed his arms, regarding her with a mix of contempt and pity. "Help you? You dug your own grave, Tiff. I told you not to mess with her, but you didn't listen. And now what? You think I can save you when management is already sharpening their knives?" Tiffany let out a choked scream, her voice breaking under the weight of her fear. "But I didn't mean to. I just thought she didn't belong in first class. I didn't know who she was." She grabbed onto Jake's sleeve, tears streaming down her face. "You have to tell them. Tell them I didn't know." Jake yanked his arm free and took a step back. "You think they care?" he scoffed. "You tripped her, threw juice on her, in front of the whole damn cabin, Tiff. The security cameras caught everything. You're finished." In the economy class cabin, Sasha remained seated, her expression calm but with a subtle glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. The orange juice on her shirt had mostly dried, leaving uneven stains on the black fabric, but she made no effort to change or clean it. For her, it was evidence, a reminder of the price Tiffany would have to pay. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, unlocked the screen. A message from Jamal. "Management just called the captain. They know everything. That bitch is shaking like a leaf. What do you want me to do next?" Sasha read the message, her fingers gliding swiftly over the screen as she typed back. "Let her crumble on her own. I want her to feel every second of it." She hit send, locked her phone and leaned back into her seat. There was nothing more she needed to do. Jamal and the system she had in place would handle the rest. But the satisfaction in her chest still wasn't enough. She wanted to see Tiffany break, not by kneeling but through the sheer gut-wrenching panic of realizing exactly who she had just crossed. Emily Parker stepped into the economy class cabin, holding a small napkin in her hand, her eyes filled with concern as she looked at Sasha. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice unsteady with nerves. "I just heard some people in the galley talking. Tiffany, Sasha cut her off, her voice soft but chilling. I'm fine, Emily. Thank you. Don't worry, everything will be taken care of. She took the napkin from Emily's hand, lightly dabbing at the dried juice on her wrist before offering a faint smile. Just focus on your job. Emily nodded, though the worry in her eyes lingered. If you need anything, just call me. She turned to leave, but her posture made it clear. She knew a storm was brewing and Tiffany stood right at its center. Back in the galley, Tiffany had collapsed onto a seat, her hands clutching her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm done for, Jake, she mumbled, her voice trembling with fear. A shareholder, the board of directors. I can't believe this. How did I not see it? How could I be this stupid? Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze cold and unyielding. You didn't see it because you only look at the surface, Tiff. You saw a black woman, dressed differently from the rich guys you usually suck up to, and you thought she didn't belong. Well, guess what? Do you regret it now? Tiffany looked up, her eyes red and swollen. You think I did it on purpose? I didn't know. I just wanted to keep first class for the right people, she shouted, but her voice wavered as if she didn't believe her own words. The right people? Jake let out a sharp, mocking laugh. And who exactly are the right people? The fat old white men you bow down to? You're a damn fool, Tiff. And your stupidity just cost you everything. Tiffany shot up from her seat, grabbing Jake's shirt in desperation. You have to help me. Tell the captain I didn't know. Tell them I didn't mean it, she screamed, mascara and tears streaking down her face in dark, smudged lines. Jake pushed her away, his voice cold. I can't help you. You did this to yourself, now deal with it. And if I were you, I'd start praying that Sasha Brooks doesn't decide to take this to court. Because with her power, you won't just lose your job, you'll lose your whole life. Tiffany staggered back into the seat, her hands trembling as she clutched her head. She recalled Sasha's gaze, not when she was tripped, not when she was doused in juice, but that final look Sasha had given her before returning to her seat. Cold, powerful. That was the moment Tiffany realized she hadn't just messed with a passenger, she had provoked a monster she could never hope to fight. In the economy cabin, Sasha could hear the murmurs of the passengers around her. A man seated a few rows ahead turned to whisper to the woman beside him. I heard the captain just called that flight attendant up. Looks like she messed with the wrong person. The woman nodded, her eyes glinting with curiosity. I saw her throw juice at that lady. That was insane. Sasha heard them but didn't react. She simply sat there, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, a faint satisfaction in her eyes. Her phone vibrated again. A message from Jamal. The captain just informed the whole crew. That bitch is crying in the galley. You want me to push further? Sasha typed back. No. Let her feel it. I want her to remember this day forever. She hit send, locked her phone and leaned back into her seat. The orange juice had dried on her shirt, but the faint citrus scent still lingered, a reminder of the price of ignorance. She didn't need to scream or strike back at Tiffany. All she had to do was sit still, let her power do the work and watch as Tiffany crumbled from the inside out. In the galley, Tiffany remained slumped in her seat, her face buried in her hands, tears dripping onto the floor. She knew there was no escape, not from this plane, not from this mistake. Sasha Brooks wasn't just a passenger, she was someone who could crush Tiffany's career with the snap of her fingers. And as the plane soared through the clouds, Tiffany came to a horrifying realization. She hadn't just lost, she had lost the moment she opened her mouth. Sky-High Airlines Flight 472 touched down at JFK Airport with a smooth landing, the wheels gliding along the runway like the closing note of a dramatic symphony. The hum of the engines softened, and the tense atmosphere inside the cabin slowly dissipated as passengers stood up, retrieving their luggage from the overhead compartments. Laughter, zippers unzipping, the shuffle of feet, signs of a journey's end. But for Tiffany Hayes, this moment wasn't a relief, it was the beginning of a nightmare she knew she couldn't escape. Standing by the exit near the aircraft door, she clutched an empty serving tray as if it were a lifeline. Her face was still streaked with the remnants of mascara from her breakdown in the galley, her red-rimmed eyes staring blankly at the passengers disembarking, too afraid to meet anyone's gaze. She had tried to wipe her face, to regain some semblance of professionalism before landing, but the tremble in her stance and the slight twitch in her fingers betrayed her. Tiffany was no longer the arrogant flight attendant who had tripped Sasha Brooks or thrown juice at her. She was just a shell of herself, a woman who had walked straight into disaster and now had no choice but to wait for it to come crashing down on her. Sasha Brooks was the last to leave the economy cabin. She rose slowly, pulling her leather briefcase from beneath the seat before brushing away the dried orange juice stain on her black blazer. Most of the passengers had already disembarked, leaving the aisle empty, and Sasha stepped forward with the same deadly composure she had maintained throughout the flight. The lingering sweetness of citrus clung to her, but it did nothing to diminish the sheer aura of authority radiating from every step she took. She wasn't in a hurry, there was no need to be. She knew Tiffany was standing by the exit, and she wanted her to see her one last time before the real storm hit. As Sasha approached the door, Tiffany turned and their eyes met. Tiffany blinked, her lips trembling as she forced a weak, shaky smile. "Just thank you for flying with us, Ms. Brooks," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. But the way her head dipped, the way her hands trembled at her sides, showed that there was no arrogance left in her, only raw, unfiltered fear. Sasha stopped, her cold gaze locking onto Tiffany like a predator studying wounded prey. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply looked at her, the silence heavier than any words. Then, in a voice as sharp as a blade, she spoke. "I'm sure we'll see each other again." Each word landed like a dagger to Tiffany's gut. Then Sasha walked past her, never looking back, leaving Tiffany standing there with the gut-wrenching feeling of having been punched straight in the stomach. Jake Russo stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching Tiffany with an expression devoid of sympathy. "You good?" he asked. But there was no concern in his tone, just mockery. Tiffany turned to him, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "Did you hear that?" she said. "We'll see each other again?" "Jake, what am I supposed to do? I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to get sued." She lunged forward, gripping Jake's sleeve in desperation. "You have to help me." Jake yanked his arm free, stepping back. "Help you?" he scoffed. "Tiff, you did this to yourself. I told you not to mess with her, but you didn't listen. And now, she's a shareholder. She's on the board. And you made her your enemy. I can't help you." Tiffany staggered, clutching her head. "But I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. If I had known who she was, I never would have." She stopped. The words felt hollow even to her. What she had done was plain for everyone to see. Passengers had recorded it, cameras had captured it, and now management was waiting for her on the ground. The aircraft door sealed shut behind Sasha, and moments later 2 uniformed security officers stepped in from the jet bridge. They were tall, stone-faced, their eyes scanning the cabin before settling on Tiffany. "Are you Tiffany Hayes?" one of them asked, his deep voice carrying an air of authority. Tiffany blinked, her hands shaking as she slowly released her grip on the tray. "Why, yeah. I'm Tiffany," she mumbled, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Come with us," the other officer said, offering no further explanation. "We have a few questions about what happened on this flight." Tiffany turned to Jake, eyes wide with desperation. "Jake, can you come with me?" "I don't want to go alone," she cried, her voice cracking with fear. Jake shook his head and stepped back. "I'm not getting involved in this, Tiff. You're on your own." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Tiffany standing there, tears streaming down her face as the 2 security officers flanked her. Her legs trembled so badly that she nearly stumbled as they led her down the stairs. A short distance away, the rest of the crew, Emily Parker and a few others, watched from afar, whispering among themselves. "She deserves it," Emily muttered to another flight attendant, her tone laced with disdain. "Throwing juice on a passenger? Tripping her? Who does she think she is?" Meanwhile, Sasha had already reached the terminal, standing near the exit gate with her leather briefcase in hand. She pulled out her phone and checked her messages. Jamal had texted, "Security took her. Management wants to talk about next steps. How do you want to handle this?" Sasha typed back quickly, "Keep it professional. This isn't personal revenge, I want systemic change. Send me the report when it's done." She hit send, slipped her phone into her pocket, and glanced at the bustling terminal crowd with a calm expression. But beneath that composure, the fire inside her still burned. She hadn't forgotten the humiliation of being tripped, of orange juice splattering all over her in front of the entire cabin. She hadn't forgotten Tiffany's sneer, the way she spat out "bitch" and "trash," as if Sasha were beneath her. But Sasha wasn't the type to scream or lash out in the moment. She was the type to let her enemies collapse under the weight of their own mistakes. And now Tiffany was paying that price. In the airport security office, Tiffany was ushered into a small, sterile room with a metal table and 2 rigid chairs. The 2 security officers stood by the door, arms crossed, watching her like an animal in a cage. Tiffany sat down, hands shaking as she clutched her head, tears dripping onto the table. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, voice breaking. "I didn't know who she was." One of the officers stepped forward, placing a firm hand on the table as he leaned in. "Miss Hayes, we've received a report from Sky High Airlines management. You are accused of assaulting passenger Sasha Brooks, tripping her and throwing juice on her. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Tiffany lifted her tear-streaked face, her bloodshot eyes pleading. I didn't assault her. I just wanted her to know her place. I didn't know she was a shareholder. I swear I didn't know," she burst out, slamming a trembling fist onto the table. The officer raised an eyebrow, his voice turning icy. "Know her place? What exactly do you mean by that? Because she's black? Because she doesn't look like the rich men you're used to serving?" Tiffany's breath hitched, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The words hit her like a slap, forcing her to confront not just what she had done but why. Her head dropped as fresh tears spilled onto the table. "I didn't mean it like that. I didn't know." The officer straightened and folded his arms. Sky High Airlines has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. The cabin cameras caught everything, and multiple passengers have provided witness statements. You'll have to explain yourself to management, but I'll be honest with you, your career is over. Tiffany looked up, her face pale. "Over? What do you mean? Are they going to fire me?" The security guard didn't answer. He simply turned away, leaving Tiffany sitting there, her reality crumbling around her. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her cries echoed in the cold, sterile room, like a funeral dirge for the career she had spent 10 years building. Outside in the terminal, Sasha stood waiting for her car, her expression calm as she watched the flow of people passing by. A sleek black sedan pulled up, and the driver stepped out, opening the door for her. "Ms. Brooks, everything is ready," he said respectfully. Sasha nodded, stepping into the car and settling into the back seat with an air of quiet authority. She pulled out her phone once more, reading an email from Sky High Airlines management. "We have suspended Tiffany Hayes and are conducting a full investigation. Would you like to meet with us to discuss further actions?" Sasha quickly typed back, "I will meet if necessary. Ensure the investigation is thorough and send me the results." She hit send, then leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes. She didn't feel joy knowing Tiffany was crying in an airport security room. For Sasha, this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. She wanted Tiffany to feel the weight of ignorance and prejudice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated like garbage simply because of their skin color or appearance. As the car pulled away from the airport, Sasha opened her eyes, gazing out the window, a flicker of satisfaction in her expression. Tiffany might lose her job, but the system she represented, that was Sasha's true target. And she wouldn't stop until it changed. In the security room, Tiffany remained seated, sobbing, her hands clutching her head. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from a former colleague. "Heard you got suspended. What happened?" Tiffany stared at the message but didn't reply. She knew the rumors would spread quickly, that friends and family would ask questions. She also knew that the label "flight attendant fired for discrimination" would follow her forever. She had lost everything, not just her job but her dignity. And now, she was left only with fear and regret, emotions that would haunt her every night from this moment on. Meanwhile, Sasha Brooks' black sedan glided through the busy streets of Manhattan, city lights reflecting off the windows like scattered fireflies in the dark. She sat in the back seat, her gaze steady on the world outside, but deep inside, the satisfaction from what had happened on the flight hadn't fully settled. The dried orange juice on her black blazer left faint stains, battle scars not for boasting, but as a reminder of the cost of prejudice and the power she held to dismantle it. Sasha was not someone who sat back and relished a victory. To her, Tiffany Hayes' suspension was only the beginning, a single brick in the long road she intended to build. Her phone vibrated beside her. She picked it up and unlocked the screen. A message from Jamal: "Management just finished their meeting. Tiffany Hayes has been suspended indefinitely, but they want you to meet to discuss the next steps. What do you want to do?" Sasha's fingers moved swiftly across the screen. "Good. I'll meet with them but not for revenge. I want systemic change, retraining all staff, revising policies and ensuring this never happens again. Set up the meeting." She hit send, then leaned back, closing her eyes once more, letting the honking horns and relentless rhythm of New York City fade into the background of her thoughts. She didn't forget the humiliation of being tripped in the aisle, of having orange juice splattered all over her in front of an entire cabin of passengers. She didn't forget the way Tiffany called her a bitch and trash, the look of disdain in her eyes as if Sasha didn't deserve to sit in first class simply because of the color of her skin. But Sasha wasn't someone who let those moments define her. She turned them into fuel, into a driving force to dismantle the system that had allowed people like Tiffany to thrive. To her, this wasn't just personal, it was about the thousands of others who had been treated like garbage simply because they didn't look like the kind of people society deemed worthy. The car pulled up in front of a towering skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, the corporate headquarters of Sky High Airlines. The driver stepped out and opened the door for Sasha. "Ms. Brooks, we've arrived," he said respectfully. Sasha nodded, stepping out with an air of authority, her leather briefcase in hand like a weapon ready for battle. She hadn't bothered to wear the blazer stained with orange juice. She had chosen instead a long gray coat, elegant yet commanding, a silent statement that she had nothing to prove to anyone. Inside the building, tension hung heavy in the air of the large conference room on the 20th floor. A group of executives, Sky High senior management, sat around a long table, their faces etched with concern. As Sasha entered, the room fell silent, every gaze turning toward her. Jamal stood in the corner, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as he watched her walk in. "Ms. Brooks," a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair rose from his seat, extending a hand. "I'm Richard Klein, Chief Executive Officer. Thank you for coming." Sasha gave a curt nod and took a seat at the head of the table, setting her briefcase down in front of her. "I didn't come here for gratitude," she said, her voice low but sharp. "I came to make sure what happened on that flight never happens again, not to me, not to anyone." Richard swallowed, adjusting his tie. "We understand and we deeply apologize for Ms. Hayes' behavior. She has been suspended indefinitely, and we are conducting an internal investigation." "Suspension isn't enough," Sasha cut in, her gaze locked onto Richard. "Tiffany Hayes isn't the only problem. The problem is that your system allowed her to believe she had the right to trip me, to throw juice on me, to call me trash, just because I don't look like the rich white men she's used to serving. Your entire organization needs change, top to bottom." Silence fell over the room. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Richard nodded slowly, scribbling something onto his notepad. "You're right," he admitted. "We've already begun reviewing our policies, but we want to hear from you. What do you want us to do?" Sasha leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping lightly on the table, a habit she had kept from her school days in Harlem. "Retrain every employee, not just flight attendants but managers, security, everyone," she said. "I want comprehensive anti-bias and cultural sensitivity training, not the half-hearted kind you roll out just to check a box. I want clear policies, anyone who violates them is out. No negotiations. And I want periodic reports so I know you're not just saying the right things, you're doing them." Richard nodded more quickly now, sweat beading on his forehead. "We can do that. I'll have the HR team start immediately." "Not just HR," Sasha interrupted again. "I want management involved too. If you don't understand what bias is, don't expect your employees to. I'm not here for optics, Richard. I'm here to make sure no one ever has to go through what I did." From the corner of the room, Jamal smirked wider, his eyes gleaming with pride. Richard kept nodding, his voice unsteady. "All right, we'll do it. Do you want to oversee the process?" Sasha nodded. "I will oversee it. Send me a detailed plan within 48 hours. If I'm not satisfied, I'll take this to the board, and trust me, you don't want that to happen." The entire room nodded in unison, no one daring to protest. Sasha rose, grabbing her leather briefcase, and walked out of the conference room with a calm but commanding presence. As she reached the elevators, Jamal caught up, clapping her on the shoulder. "You're a beast, Sasha," he said, admiration in his voice. "You just made the whole management team piss themselves." Sasha gave a dry chuckle. "I don't need them scared. I need them to act. If they don't, I'll make them regret ever being born." Meanwhile, across the city, Tiffany Hayes sat in her cramped, run-down apartment in Queens, the flickering fluorescent light overhead making the space feel even more suffocating. She wore an old, tattered t-shirt and shorts, her eyes red and swollen as she stared at the suspension notice on the table, a cold, impersonal white sheet with a few lines of black text from Sky High Airlines. "Miss Tiffany Hayes, due to violations of the anti-discrimination policy, you are suspended indefinitely as of March 12, 2025. Pending further investigation." She read it over and over, her trembling fingers gripping the edge of the table, tears slipping down her face. She could still hear Sasha's voice in her head, "We'll meet again." That icy stare had burned itself into her memory. Tiffany couldn't believe it had come to this. 10 years as a flight attendant, 10 years bowing to passengers, 10 years taking pride in that blue uniform, and it was all gone because of one stupid decision on that flight. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, the empty apartment echoing her cries like a late confession of guilt. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from her mother. "Are you okay? I heard you got suspended. What happened?" Tiffany stared at the text but didn't reply. She couldn't face anyone, not her mother, not her friends, not her former co-workers. She knew the rumors had already spread, knew that people were whispering about the idiot flight attendant who messed with a major shareholder. She turned on the TV, desperate for a distraction, but the screen immediately flashed with a breaking news segment. Sky High Airlines faces controversy after a flight attendant assaults a first-class passenger. Tiffany shut the TV off instantly, throwing the remote across the floor. "Bullshit," she screamed. "I didn't assault anyone. I didn't mean to." She stood up, pacing back and forth in the small room, her hands clutching her head. She recalled the moment Sasha fell into the aisle, the moment the orange juice splattered all over her. At that time Tiffany had felt triumphant, but now that feeling had turned into fear and regret. She hadn't just lost her job, she had lost her dignity, her future. She collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her cries blending with the sounds of traffic outside like a funeral dirge for her life. In Manhattan, Sasha sat in her office, a spacious room with glass windows overlooking the New York City skyline. She pulled out her laptop and opened an email from Sky High, a preliminary plan for the bias training program and policy revisions. She skimmed through it, noting a few areas that needed improvement, then sent it back with the message, "Good, but not enough. Add personal accountability for senior management. Resend within 24 hours." She closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair and took a sip of hot coffee. She didn't feel happy about Tiffany's suspension. For her, this wasn't a personal victory. Sasha had grown up in Harlem, where bias was a daily reality. She had been followed by supermarket security, underestimated by teachers, and denied opportunities simply because of the color of her skin. But she never let those things break her. She used them to build her strength, to climb to a position where no one could touch her. And now, she was using that position to ensure that no one else had to endure what she had. Her phone vibrated again, a message from Emily Parker, the flight attendant from that flight. "Ms. Brooks, I just heard Tiffany was suspended. Thank you for standing up. You're an inspiration to me." Sasha read it and gave a faint smile. She typed back, "Thank you, Emily. Keep doing your job well." She hit send, then stood up and stepped onto the balcony, looking down at the city illuminated by countless lights. For Sasha, what happened on that flight wasn't the end, it was the beginning. She knew changing a system wouldn't be easy, that there would be more people like Tiffany out there. But she wasn't afraid, she had power, patience, and a fire inside her that drove her forward. As the night wind swept through, Sasha took a deep breath, embracing the biting cold of New York. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, and she wouldn't stop until the system was forced to bow to the truth. The night wind howled through the balcony of Sasha Brooks' office in the heart of Manhattan, carrying the piercing chill of a mid-March evening. She stood there, a cup of now cold coffee in her hand, her eyes quietly scanning the dazzling city below, the skyscrapers standing tall like unyielding flames, the bustling streets flowing with cars like a never-ending bloodstream. Tonight, despite the long day, she didn't feel exhausted. She felt alive, as if the sky-high incident had awakened a part of her she never knew existed. But that sense of fulfillment wasn't about victory, it was determination, a slow-burning fire in her chest, urging her to go further, to do more. Sasha took a sip of coffee, the bitterness sliding down her throat, sharpening her focus. She had just received an email from Sky High Airlines, a detailed plan for the anti-bias training program she had demanded, along with a commitment from management to implement it within the month. She read through each line, each section, mentally noting a few points for revision, just as she had always done since her school days in Harlem, when she filled her notebooks with big dreams. But this time she wasn't just doing it for herself, she was doing it for those who had been treated like her, for those who had been seen as not belonging simply because of their skin color, their clothes, or the way they carried themselves. She set her coffee cup down on the balcony railing, pulled out her phone, and opened a message from Emily Parker. "Ms. Brooks, I just heard management talking about the new training program today. They said it was because of you. Thank you, really. Sasha gave a faint smile and typed back, "It's nothing, Emily. Just make sure they follow through on their promise." She hit send, then slipped her phone into her pocket and turned back to look at the city. She thought about Emily, the young flight attendant with a genuine smile, the one who had handed her a cup of water when she was shoved into economy class. Sasha had recommended to Jamal that Emily deserved a promotion, and she knew the girl would do well. To Sasha, change wasn't just about punishing the wrongdoers, it was about uplifting the right ones. She stepped back inside, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop again. A new email from Jamal popped up. "Tiffany Hayes has been officially terminated. Management wants to meet with you next week for a progress update. Do you want me to go with you?" Sasha paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She felt no joy in knowing Tiffany had lost her job. She wasn't the kind of person who took pleasure in others' suffering, even those who had called her trash and thrown orange juice at her. To Sasha, Tiffany's firing wasn't the end goal, it was merely part of a bigger process, a lesson she wanted the entire system to remember. She typed back, "Good. I'll meet them alone. Thanks, Jamal." She hit send, then leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She remembered that day on the flight, the humiliation of falling in the aisle, the sickly sweet smell of orange juice clinging to her clothes, the contempt in Tiffany's eyes, silently telling her she didn't belong. But she also remembered how she stood up, held her composure, and turned that humiliation into strength. Sasha had grown up in Harlem, where every day was a battle, being watched by supermarket security, mocked by peers for having big dreams, forced into a box that she refused to accept. She had shattered that box, and now she was breaking down even bigger ones, like the system that had enabled people like Tiffany. Across the city, in a rundown apartment in Queens, Tiffany Hayes sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her red-rimmed eyes staring into nothingness. In front of her lay the printed termination letter from Sky High Airlines, sent via email and printed out so she couldn't deny the reality weighing on her shoulders. "Miss Tiffany Hayes, following an investigation, we have concluded that your actions constitute a serious violation of our anti-discrimination policy. Your employment is officially terminated as of March 15, 2025. She had read those words dozens of times, each reading slicing into what was left of her shattered pride. She clutched her head, tears rolling down her cheeks, falling onto the scratched wooden floor beneath her. "Fuck. How did it come to this?" she whispered, her voice hoarse with regret. Her tiny apartment now felt like a prison. The TV was off, her phone silent, no messages from colleagues or friends. The rumors had spread everywhere, and Tiffany knew exactly what people were saying behind her back. The dumb girl messed with a major shareholder, she deserved to lose her job. Who the hell discriminates on a plane? Tiffany had once taken pride in her blue uniform, once thought she was in control of first class, but now, all of it was nothing but ashes. She stood up, staggering toward the kitchen counter, pulling open a drawer to grab a cheap bottle of liquor she had bought the week before. She poured herself a full glass, her hands trembling, causing the liquid to spill over the rim. Then she downed it in one gulp. The burning sensation sliding down her throat didn't numb her pain, it only made it sharper. She remembered Sasha's eyes as she left the plane, "We'll meet again," and that cold voice haunted her every night like a curse. Tiffany had once thought Sasha was weak, someone she could step on to assert her own power. But now, Sasha was the one who had won, and Tiffany was nothing but a pathetic loser. She slumped into a chair, opened her laptop and pulled up her emails again. A new message from Jake Russo appeared. "Tiff, I heard you got fired. You okay?" Tiffany stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to reply, wanted to scream that she wasn't okay, that she regretted everything, that she wished she could go back to before it all fell apart. But she didn't type a single word. She knew Jake didn't actually care, knew he was only asking out of obligation before turning his back on her like everyone else. She closed the laptop, got up and walked to the window looking down at the busy street below. She thought about her mother in Ohio who would call this weekend and ask, "Did you really lose your job? How could you be so stupid?" She thought about her so-called friends, the ones who used to envy her flight attendant job, who were probably laughing behind her back now. And she thought about Sasha, the woman she had once despised, the woman she believed didn't deserve to sit in first class, but who had now completely destroyed her world. Tiffany buried her face in her hands and sobbed, her cries blending with the sounds of honking cars outside, like a funeral dirge for her life. But then, in the depths of her despair, a thought flickered in her mind. She couldn't change the past, couldn't get her job back, but maybe, just maybe, she could do something to keep from sinking completely. She stumbled back to her desk, opened her laptop again and began typing an email, not to Sky High. Not to beg Sasha for mercy, but to a non-profit organization she had once heard about, one that specialized in diversity and inclusion training. "My name is Tiffany Hayes," she typed, her hands still shaking. "I just lost my job because of a stupid mistake involving bias. I want to learn. I want to change. Can you help me?" She hit send, then collapsed back into her chair, gasping for breath. She had no idea if the email would be answered, no idea if she could pull herself out of the wreckage of her life. But for the first time in days she felt a glimmer of hope, small, fragile, but enough to stop her from crying. Tiffany knew she had been wrong, knew she had paid the price. And now she wanted to prove she was more than just the failure Sasha had defeated. In Manhattan, Sasha received an unexpected email the next morning, forwarded by Sky High Airlines. Subject: an apology from Tiffany Hayes. She opened it and read every word Tiffany had written in her desperation. "Ms. Brooks, I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want to apologize. I was wrong to treat you that way, not because you're a shareholder but because you're a human being. I've lost everything and I deserve it. I'm trying to change, to learn, and I hope you know that your actions opened my eyes. Thank you, even if you don't need my thanks." Sasha finished reading, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. She didn't feel satisfaction nor anger, just a slight sense of surprise. She hadn't expected Tiffany to write those words, hadn't expected her to acknowledge her mistakes. Sasha typed back, "Thank you for writing. Change begins with awareness and I hope you're on the right path." She hit send, then closed her laptop and stepped onto the balcony once more. She looked down at the city, where the morning sunlight reflected off the skyscrapers, making them shimmer like dreams. Sasha knew that what had happened with Tiffany wasn't the end, it was just part of a bigger fight, a battle she would never give up on. She thought of people like Emily, like Jamal, like her younger self, those who had been overlooked but never backed down. And she thought of Tiffany, once an enemy, but now perhaps proof that change was possible. Sasha took a deep breath, feeling the crisp New York air fill her lungs. She didn't know if Tiffany would truly change, didn't know if Sky High would keep its promises. But she knew one thing: she wouldn't stop. With every step forward, she would continue to fight. For justice, for fairness, for a world where no one had to fall because of someone else's bias. She turned back inside, picked up her coffee, took one last sip, and smiled. A small smile, but one filled with determination. The golden morning light streamed through the windows of Sasha Brooks' office in the heart of Manhattan, casting dancing streaks of gold across the polished wooden floor. Sasha stood by her desk, holding a freshly brewed cup of coffee, its steam curling around her face, a gentle reminder that she was still here, still fighting. It had been 2 months since the incident on the Sky High Airlines flight, 2 months of tense meetings, back and forth emails, and sleepless nights ensuring that the system that had once enabled Tiffany Hayes had no room for bias anymore. Today she received the final report from Sky High's management, and the feeling swelling in her chest wasn't triumph, it was relief. It was belief that what she had done was starting to make a difference. She set down her coffee, opened her laptop, and clicked on the latest email from Richard Klein, the CEO of Sky High Airlines. Subject: Progress Report on Training and Policy Reforms. Sasha read through every line, every statistic. More than 3,000 employees had undergone anti-bias training over the past 8 weeks, from flight attendants to senior management. A new policy had been enacted, explicitly stating that any discriminatory behavior would lead to immediate termination, and a hotline had been set up for passengers to report incidents directly to upper management. Richard ended the email with a single, slightly shaky sentence. "Ms. Brooks, we hope you're satisfied with what we've done. Thank you for pushing us to change." Sasha leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk, a habit she had kept since her school days in Harlem, when each tap was a reminder that she was moving forward. She didn't reply immediately, she wanted to think, to absorb the weight of what she had just read. 2 months ago she had been tripped in the airplane aisle, had orange juice thrown on her, had been called trash, simply because of the color of her skin. But now, that humiliating moment had ignited a movement for change, not just for her but for the thousands of others who could now step onto a plane without being met with scornful eyes. She stood up, stepped onto the balcony and looked down at New York City waking up. The streets were crowded with cars, honking horns blending into a chaotic symphony, and people of all races and backgrounds moving about. A vibrant portrait of America, imperfect yet beloved. Sasha thought about her mother who had worked 12-hour shifts at a grocery store to raise her, about the days she had squeezed onto packed buses in Harlem, trailed by supermarket security just because she wore an old hoodie, about how she had turned every ounce of disdain into fuel to climb her way up to becoming a shareholder of Sky High Airlines. And now she was using that position to make a change, not for revenge but to build a better future. She pulled out her phone and called Jamal. The line rang twice before his deep voice came through the speaker. "Sasha, calling me this early? Something good happen?" Sasha smirked. "I just read the report from Sky High. They did better than I expected. The training program is complete and the new policies are in place. What do you think?" Jamal whistled through the phone, impressed. "Damn, Sasha. 2 months ago I thought you just wanted to crush that Tiffany chick. But you made the whole damn airline bow down. I'm proud of you for real." Sasha's lips curled slightly. "I don't need them to bow. I need them to change. Tiffany was just one piece. The bigger issue is the system, and I want to make sure there's no room left for people like her." Jamal chuckled. "Yeah, you're right. Oh, by the way, I heard she's working for some nonprofit now. Looks like she's trying to make amends. What do you think?" Sasha paused, her gaze thoughtful. "If she's really changed, good for her. But I don't really care, she's the past. I'm looking forward." She ended the call, slipped the phone into her pocket, then walked back inside and sat at her desk. She opened a new document, drafting notes for her next meeting with Sky High. She wanted them to expand their training programs to other airlines, to turn this into something bigger than just one company. Sasha wasn't the type to stop. Every victory was just a stepping stone to go further, and she wouldn't rest until the system was truly fair. In Queens, a few miles away, Tiffany Hayes stepped into the small office of the nonprofit organization Bridges to Equity, a group focused on diversity and inclusion training, the same one she had reached out to after losing her job. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, with no trace of the blue uniform she had once taken so much pride in. Her hair was tied back in a low ponytail, her face bare of makeup, and her eyes still red from sleepless nights. Tiffany looked like a different person, no longer the arrogant flight attendant who had once tripped Sasha in the airplane aisle. She sat across from an older woman named Marla, the director of the organization. Marla had silver white hair and sharp eyes, but her voice was warm as she asked, "Tiffany, in your email you said you wanted to change. Tell me what happened." Tiffany swallowed hard, gripping the edge of her chair. I used to be a flight attendant for Sky High Airlines. 2 months ago I did something incredibly stupid. I tripped a passenger, spilled juice on her, and called her awful names. I thought she didn't belong in first class just because she was black and didn't look like the people I was used to serving. I had no idea she was a major shareholder. I was fired and I deserved it." Marla nodded slowly, jotting something down on her notepad. "And what do you want now?" Tiffany lifted her gaze, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to understand why I thought that way. I want to learn how to stop hurting people. I've lost everything, my job, my reputation, my friends, but I don't want to lose the chance to become a better person." Marla gave her a small, knowing smile. "All right, Tiffany. Change isn't easy, but you've taken the first step, acknowledging your mistakes. We'll help you. You'll take courses, work with the community, and confront what you've done. Are you ready?" Tiffany nodded, her voice trembling. "I'm ready." She left the office with a folder of materials in her hands. Her steps were still heavy, but they felt a little steadier. She knew the road ahead would be long and not everyone would forgive her, especially not Sasha Brooks. But for the first time she felt like she was heading in the right direction, even if it was just a small step. Back in Manhattan, Sasha received an unexpected call from Emily Parker at the end of the day. "Ms. Brooks, I just got promoted to lead flight attendant," Emily said, excitement evident in her voice. "They said it was because of your recommendation. I don't know how to thank you, you've really changed everything." Sasha smiled lightly. "Congratulations, Emily. Do your job well and make sure no one else is treated the way I was." Emily laughed. "I promise, Ms. Brooks. Oh, and I heard that other airlines are starting to take notice of Sky High's training program. Looks like you're not just changing us, you're changing the entire industry. Sasha smirked. Good. This is just the beginning. She ended the call and stepped onto the balcony once more. The sun was setting, painting the New York sky in brilliant shades of orange, like the fire burning inside her. She thought about Tiffany, a former enemy now trying to make amends. She thought about Emily, who would lead the next generation of flight attendants. And she thought about herself, a girl from Harlem who had turned humiliation into strength and used it to transform an entire system. Taking a deep breath, she let the crisp evening air fill her lungs. Sasha knew the fight wasn't over, there were still more Tiffany's out there, more systems that needed to be dismantled. But she also knew one thing. She had planted a seed and it was growing, spreading further than she had ever imagined. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Sasha smiled, a small smile but full of hope. She was no longer just the victim of an incident on a flight, she was the catalyst for a better future. And she would keep fighting step by step until the world changed with her. In Queens, Tiffany sat on the bus ride home, holding a folder from Bridges to Equity, her eyes carrying a hint of determination. She gazed out the window watching people of all races pass by, and for the first time she didn't feel disdain, she felt curiosity, a desire to understand. She knew she couldn't erase the past but she could rewrite the future. And somewhere deep inside her, a small glimmer of hope flickered, that one day she could look Sasha Brooks in the eye without having to lower her head in shame. On a balcony in Manhattan, Sasha took the last sip of her coffee, watching as the sky darkened. She knew the road ahead was long but she was ready, for herself, for people like Emily and even for people like Tiffany, those who could learn to rise from their mistakes. For Sasha this wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. And she wouldn't stop until justice truly prevailed. Legacy of Sasha Brooks. Autumn in New York carried a crisp chill, with golden leaves scattered across the cobblestone streets of Midtown Manhattan. Sasha Brooks stood in the grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis, the glow of crystal chandeliers casting light on her deep blue gown, a silent yet powerful statement. It was October 15, 2025, 7 months since the Sky High Airlines incident, and Sasha was preparing to deliver a speech at the annual Aviation Summit, where CEOs, policymakers, and industry leaders gathered to discuss the future of aviation. But for Sasha, this wasn't just a speech, it was a moment to cement the legacy she had begun building, to turn that humiliating day on the plane into a beacon of change for an entire generation. Backstage, she held the speech she had rewritten dozens of times, each word carefully chosen to be both bold and inspiring. Beyond the curtain, over 500 attendees engaged in lively conversations, the clinking of wine glasses creating a symphony of refinement. Sasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of anticipation and hope settle in her chest. She was no longer the girl from Harlem, crammed onto a crowded bus or eyed suspiciously by security guards in a supermarket. She was Sasha Brooks, shareholder of Sky High Airlines, the woman who had forced an entire industry to confront its own biases. The host, a middle-aged man with a warm NPR-style voice, stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone to quiet the room. Ladies and gentlemen, up next, we have someone who has sent shockwaves through the aviation industry this year. Please welcome Sasha Brooks, shareholder of Sky High Airlines and the catalyst behind a historic shift in our industry's approach to bias and discrimination. The crowd erupted into applause with a few whistles piercing the air. Sasha stepped forward with the deadly poise she had honed over the years. She didn't smile, she didn't need to. The sharpness in her gaze and the unwavering set of her shoulders were enough to silence the entire room. She placed her speech on the podium, looked directly at the audience and began to speak, her voice low but resounding. 7 months ago, I was tripped and sent sprawling in the aisle of a Sky High Airlines flight. I had orange juice thrown on me. I was called trash and a dog. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I didn't look like someone a flight attendant thought deserved to be in first class. I'm not here to retell that story as a victim. I'm here to tell you that that day changed not just my life, but this entire industry. The room was utterly still, the only sounds being the faint breaths of the audience and the soft clicks of recorders from journalists in the front row. Sasha continued, her voice rising, filled with conviction. I'm not standing here asking for pity. I'm standing here demanding accountability, from you, from your companies, from the very system we have built. Since that incident, Sky High Airlines has retrained over 3,000 employees, revised its policies and set new standards. But don't think for a second that that is enough. It is not enough. Today I challenge all of you, every airline, every airport, every worker in this industry, to look in the mirror and ask yourselves, are we doing the right thing? Are we treating people like human beings? Because if we aren't, then all this luxury, she gestured toward the chandeliers and the wine glasses on the tables, is nothing more than garbage. The room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, some attendees rose to their feet, while others leaned toward their neighbors, whispering with an energy that felt electric. Sasha stood there, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, the CEOs in their tailored suits, the politicians with their carefully measured expressions, and the airline employees in the back rows, their eyes alight with hope. She didn't stop. She spoke about the emails she had received from passengers thanking her, about flight attendants like Emily Parker, who had stood up for fairness, and about how she had turned her humiliation into fuel for change. By the time she finished, the entire room was on its feet. The standing ovation was deafening, a promise that her words would not be forgotten. Sasha stepped off the stage, her fingers still gripping her speech notes. She felt lighter, but not satisfied. A speech alone couldn't change the world, but it could lay another brick in the legacy she was building. Backstage, Jamal was waiting for her. He clapped a firm hand on her shoulder. "You just shook the whole damn room, Sasha," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "I bet those CEOs are sweating bullets right now." Sasha smirked. "Good. If they're not sweating, then I haven't done enough." She stepped forward, weaving into the crowd of handshakes and congratulations, but her eyes were sharp, scanning, watching. Who would take action? Who would just talk? Meanwhile, across the city, Tiffany Hayes sat in a small classroom at Bridges to Equity in Queens. She wore a gray hoodie and jeans, a pen in her hand as she scribbled notes into an old notebook. Her eyes stayed locked on the whiteboard, where an instructor was discussing unconscious bias. It had been 7 months since she had been fired from Sky High Airlines, and those months had been a long journey, from collapse to rebirth. Tiffany was no longer the arrogant flight attendant who thought she had the right to decide who deserved first class. She was now a woman learning to see the world through different eyes, even if those eyes were still red from too many nights of regret. The instructor, a black man named Marcus with a warm voice, turned to her. "Tiffany, what do you think about unconscious bias? How does it affect our actions?" Tiffany hesitated, gripping her pen tightly. I think it's like a pair of glasses you don't even know you're wearing. It makes you see people the wrong way without realizing it. I used to think someone didn't deserve to sit in first class just because she was black. I didn't know I was wrong until I lost everything." Marcus nodded, his gaze encouraging. "Thank you for sharing. Recognizing the glasses is the first step, taking them off is the next." Tiffany lowered her head and scribbled something in her notebook, feeling just a little lighter. She no longer cried every night. Now she spent her time volunteering at this organization, helping others understand what she had once been blind to. She knew she couldn't erase the past, couldn't forget the look in Sasha Brooks' eyes as she stepped off that plane, but she could build a different future, even if it was only one small step at a time. At the Marriott Marquis after the conference, Sasha sat in a quiet corner of the hotel bar, sipping a glass of red wine, her gaze thoughtful. Emily Parker appeared unexpectedly, still in her flight attendant uniform, but no longer the timid girl who had nervously handed Sasha a drink on that fateful flight. "Ms. Brooks," Emily called out, excitement in her voice. "I just heard your speech. It was incredible. I'm here with my new team and they all said you inspired them." Sasha gave a small smile and gestured for Emily to sit. "Thank you, Emily. How have you been?" Emily nodded, her eyes bright. "Great. Since my promotion I've been training my team the way you talked about, treating people like human beings, not like seat numbers. I learned that from you." Sasha took another sip of wine, warmth spreading through her chest. "Good. Keep it up. This industry needs people like you." Emily beamed before heading back to join her team, leaving Sasha alone with her thoughts. She thought about Tiffany, once an enemy, now quietly trying to make amends in a small classroom in Queens. She thought about Emily, carrying the fire she had ignited forward. And she thought about herself, a black woman from Harlem who had once been told she didn't belong, now standing at the center of power, shaping the future. Sasha wasn't naive. She knew bias wouldn't disappear because of one speech or one training program. But she also knew that every small step mattered, and that she had planted seeds that would grow over time. Her phone buzzed, a text from Jamal. "Your speech is all over the news. CNN is calling you, the woman changing the airline industry." What do you think? Sasha typed back. I don't care what they call me. I care what they do next. She hit send, then stood up, leaving the bar with the same deadly poise that had silenced a room full of executives. As she stepped outside, the autumn wind swept past, carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves and asphalt, the distinct essence of New York. Sasha paused, looking up at the night sky, where a rare scattering of stars shimmered above the towering concrete jungle. She thought about her mother, who had passed away years ago but had always believed she was destined for something great. She thought about the kids in Harlem who could now dream bigger because of what she had done. And she thought about an America where people were seen for who they truly were, not just for how they looked. She smiled, a small smile but one filled with hope. In Queens, Tiffany stepped into her small apartment, placed her stack of documents on the table, and sank onto her worn-out couch. She turned on the TV and the CNN Evening News flashed onto the screen, showing Sasha standing on stage at the Marriott Marquis. Tiffany watched her, listening to every word. For the first time she didn't feel fear. She didn't feel shame. She felt respect. She knew she had once been part of the problem, but now she wanted to be part of the solution even if just in a small way. Sasha Brooks hadn't just changed Sky High Airlines, she had changed the way Tiffany saw the world, the way Emily did her job, and the way an entire industry was forced to reckon with itself. As night fell over New York, Sasha stepped into her car, closed her eyes, and let the autumn chill settle into her bones. She knew her legacy wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And she would keep walking step by step, until justice was not just a dream but a reality. Winter 2025 wrapped New York in an icy grip, the frigid winds slicing through the streets of Manhattan as if testing the will of anyone brave enough to step outside. Sasha Brooks stood inside a Times Square television studio, the bright stage lights beaming down on her, illuminating the black coat she wore and the unwavering sharpness in her eyes. It had been 9 months since the Sky High Airlines incident, and her name was no longer just spoken within aviation circles. It was now splashed across news reports, op-eds, and fiery social media debates. Today, March 12, 2025, she was set to appear in a live MSNBC interview to discuss the movement she had sparked. But Sasha knew better than anyone, the spotlight didn't just bring recognition. It came with a cost. She sat across from the host, Rachel Bennett, a blonde-haired, sharp-smiled white woman known for digging deep and asking questions designed to unsettle her guests. Sasha was ready for it. The camera started rolling. Rachel opened with a sweet yet pointed tone, her words dripping with careful calculation. Sasha Brooks, shareholder of Sky High Airlines, the woman who turned a personal incident into an industry-wide movement. You've been called a hero for justice. But some say you're an opportunist, using your race to build a platform for yourself. What do you say to that? Sasha tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Rachel's, unblinking. She didn't flinch at the baited question. She had heard these accusations before. From social media trolls. From conservative commentators on Fox News. Even from some people within the airline industry itself. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried through the silent studio like a low, rolling thunder. I'm not here to be a hero. And I'm not here to be an opportunist. I'm here because I was tripped on a plane. Because I had orange juice thrown at me. Because I was called trash. And no one deserves that, no matter what they look like. She let the words hang in the air for a second before adding. If someone thinks I'm taking advantage of this, then they should ask themselves, why did the system allow it to happen in the first place? Rachel smirked, clearly displeased that Sasha had sidestepped her trap so effortlessly. But isn't that exactly what happened, Ms. Brooks? She pressed. You got a flight attendant fired, you pushed Sky High into a PR crisis, and now you're everywhere, conferences, news reports, and even here today. Some say you've turned this entire situation into a personal show. Sasha let out a short, cold laugh, a smile as sharp as a blade. Tiffany Hayes lost her job because of her own actions, not because of me. I didn't push Sky High into a crisis. I pulled them out of the hole they dug for themselves by tolerating bias. And as for me being here, I didn't ask for the spotlight, it found me. And I will use it to make sure no one else is treated the way I was. If that's a personal show, so be it. But I call it responsibility. The studio fell silent. A few staff members nodded. Some whispered among themselves. Rachel raised an eyebrow, clearly thrown off by Sasha's unwavering poise, but she quickly pivoted. All right then, let's talk about your impact. Sky High has changed its policies, implemented training programs, but do you really think that fixes the problem? Bias isn't something that disappears after a few workshops, is it? Sasha nodded, her gaze thoughtful. No, it can't be erased completely, not overnight. But we can start by making sure it has nowhere to hide. She leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but resolute. I'm not naive. I know there are still people like Tiffany Hayes out there. I know there are still systems that disguise bias under a mask of professionalism. But I'm not doing this to fix the entire world. I'm doing this to plant seeds, so that others can keep this work going long after me. The interview stretched on for another 20 minutes, with Rachel's questions becoming sharper, more pointed. But Sasha never wavered. She answered every challenge with a steady, unshakable clarity that Rachel simply couldn't break. When the cameras finally shut off, Rachel stood up, extending her hand with a tight-lipped, forced smile. You're a formidable opponent, Ms. Brooks, she murmured, her tone laced with something unreadable. Sasha smirked. I'm not here to fight you, Rachel. I'm here to fight the system. She turned and walked out of the studio, her posture commanding, leaving Rachel standing there with an unreadable expression. In Queens, Tiffany Hayes sat in her small apartment, her eyes red-rimmed as she stared at the MSNBC broadcast. It had been over 9 months since she was fired. Now she worked full-time at Bridges to Equity, helping communities understand diversity and inclusion. She was no longer the arrogant flight attendant who once thought she had the right to judge others. But the shadow of her past still clung to her shoulders, especially when she saw Sasha on TV. Tiffany clutched her warm cup of tea, feeling the weight in her chest. She remembered the apology email she had sent Sasha months ago. And she remembered Sasha's response, short but kind. Change begins with awareness. Tiffany had changed. She had taken classes, confronted the biases she once failed to recognize, and now she stood before groups of people telling her story, not as a victim but as a living lesson. Yet as she watched Sasha, calm, powerful, unstoppable, on that screen, a deep ache settled within her. Because she knew. She had been the one who pushed Sasha into this spotlight. And the price she paid for it? Her career. Her reputation. And maybe even her own sense of self. She stood up, walked over to her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing a blog post for Bridges to Equity, something she did every week to share her journey. I used to think I had the right to judge others, she wrote, her hands trembling slightly. But I was wrong. Sasha Brooks didn't just cost me my job, she made me see who I really was. I'm not proud of what I did, but I am proud that I'm trying to make it right, one day at a time. She hit publish, then leaned back in her chair with a long sigh. She didn't expect Sasha to read it. She didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she was no longer the person who threw juice on a passenger and thought nothing of it. In Manhattan, Sasha stepped out of the studio into the streets of Times Square, where neon lights and massive billboards lit up the city that never slept. She paused, watching the crowds move past, faces of every race, every background, each carrying their own story. Her phone buzzed. A message from Emily Parker. Ms. Brooks, I just saw you on TV. You were incredible. My whole team is cheering for you at the airport right now. Sasha smiled, typing back. Thank you, Emily. Keep the fire burning, okay? She hit send and slipped her phone into her pocket. Just as she was about to walk away, a small group of people spotted her. Some raised their phones to take pictures. Others called out. Ms. Brooks, you're our hero. Sasha nodded politely, but there was a flicker of exhaustion in her eyes. The spotlight brought recognition, but it also carried pressure, criticism, and a loneliness no one else could see. She never told anyone, not Jamal, not Emily, that at night she still dreamed of that moment on the plane. Still heard Tiffany's voice calling her trash. She wasn't weak, but she was human. And standing up came with a price that wasn't always easy to bear. She ducked into a small cafe nearby, choosing a quiet corner, and ordered a black coffee, no sugar. As she took her first sip, an older black man, gray-haired, wearing a worn-out coat, approached her table. Ms. Brooks? He asked, his voice slightly unsteady. Sasha looked up and nodded. Yes, that's me. The man smiled, his eyes glistening. I saw you on TV. I used to be a janitor at JFK, treated like trash for 30 years. You made me feel like I matter. Thank you. Before Sasha could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there with her coffee and a quiet warmth in her chest. She gazed out the window. Snow had begun to fall, soft, glistening flakes illuminated by the streetlights. Sasha knew the spotlight wouldn't fade, the criticism, the pressure, the scrutiny would continue. But she also knew she wasn't alone. There were people like Emily. Like the old man. Like the version of herself from years ago, people who needed someone to stand up. She took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on her tongue, and smiled. A small smile. But one filled with determination. In Queens, Tiffany turned off the TV, stood up, and stepped onto the small balcony of her apartment. She watched the snow fall, felt the icy air seep through her hoodie, and thought about Sasha. She didn't know if she would ever see Sasha again. Didn't know if she would ever stand as her equal. But she knew one thing: Sasha Brooks had changed her. And she wouldn't let that change go to waste. Tiffany took a deep breath, stepped back inside, and prepared for tomorrow. Another day to make amends, to live differently. Beneath the snow-covered sky of New York, Sasha and Tiffany, two women who once stood on opposite sides, were now walking separate paths. But they were both moving toward the same horizon. The spotlight still burned bright. The price was still heavy. But they both knew. They weren't just surviving. They were creating change. Step by step. In this chaotic, imperfect, but hopeful country.